Around 1975, a young aspiring comic writer and artist named James O Barr desperately went around to some comic conventions. Eventually, he met the X-Men legend Dave Cockrum and he showed him his portfolio. Cockrum called him talentless and said he was wasting his time. How was he supposed to know that almost a decade later, James O Barr would put out one of the best and most successful comics ever made? Put simply, The Crow is a gothic punk rock tragedy filled with bullets, blood, and good old-fashioned revenge. But that would be understating how good this really is. The Crow isn't some superhero comic about a guy getting revenge like the Punisher. The kick-ass revenge is second to what's really at play here. A story of loss and grief that comes straight from a real-life tragedy. James O Barr had a pretty rough upbringing, growing up in a lonely orphanage with his brother. When he reached his teenage years, he realized he wanted to make comics because he could tell a story through both words and art. Struggling in that department, as I mentioned earlier, he found a hopeful light elsewhere. He fell in love with a girl named Beverly, and eventually she became his fiancée. But in 1978, tragedy struck in the worst possible way when she was hit by a drunk driver. In an attempt to cope with the loss, O Barr joined the Marines. While stationed in Berlin, he thought of a way that he could deal with his feelings. It was then when he began working on The Crow. Around this time in the Detroit newspaper, O Barr read of a young couple who were murdered, all because of a $20 engagement ring. With this injustice, along with his own experience, he created a story that would not only introduce an entirely unique comic character, but would also be a work of art. And I mean it when I say art as well. Certain segments are eerily photorealistic, and others are O Barr's unique gothic style. The comic is written in a non-linear way, which I believe is the way this story should be told. But we'll get to that in a second. O Barr originally had this comic fully completed as a personal work for himself, but in February 1989, the first issue was published at Caliber Comics, and it was an immediate hit with the underground, but also because this is just an excellent introduction into this world. As a side note, I just want to mention that The Crow was teased months earlier on the back of some random comic. And mother of God, if I could get this framed on my wall, I would. It reads, "For some things, there is no forgiveness. The innocent man who was Eric Draven has now been transformed into a merciless angel of death, brandishing a smoking shotgun and a goddamn samurai sword. This right here is The Crow. He's not some gay Swedish dude with 50 tattoos. Hollywood really needs to take a look at what they're adapting before they make a crappy movie of it." Speaking of Hollywood, let's talk about the 1994 adaptation starring the underrated legend Brandon Lee. Rest in peace, by the way. Now, this doesn't adapt the comic perfectly, especially around the third act of the film, but it is still utterly amazing. A lot of lines are taken straight from the comic. We get some welcome additions as well, like Eric shredding an epic solo on a rooftop. We also get to see more of the spectacularly designed city, which Matt Reeves ripped off for the Batman. Badly, might I add. In the comic, the Crow wastes hordes of these scum, dual-wielding pistols, and this is adapted directly, but with an added factor of badass. You see, Brandon Lee on the set of this film sat down the crew and made them watch and study some Hong Kong action laser discs he had. And judging from the action scenes, one can only assume that these laser discs must have been the absolutely masterful filmography of John Woo. Little off topic, but everybody watching this video right now needs to go watch those films because every single one is a masterpiece. Anyways, I've heard some people saying that the comic was cool, but the movie was better. And I hate to be that guy, but in my opinion, the comic was better. Instead of staying at one pace for the entire story like the film, the comic just keeps on escalating to a point where it becomes an almost disturbing bloodbath. I say almost because all of these guys are dirtbags who deserve it. That brings me to why this story is so powerful. As the comic goes on, we eventually see the horrendous way that Eric and his fiancée Shelley lost their lives. I can't go into detail here because of the graphic nature, but all I'll say is that it's worse than the movie, and you really want to see these guys get what they deserve. In the film, it was depicted like Eric came back from the dead, but in the comic, Eric is just a vessel for a separate entity that is much more vengeful. We can see this if we compare this scene from the comic to the film. In the film, he says Eric Draven sends his regards.
Tell them Eric Draven sends his regards.
But in the comic, he says that the Crow sends his regards. The difference is that in the comic, he is almost possessed by a supernatural force. In this same scene, we see a cop interacting with the Crow, and in their interaction, the Crow calls him boy. They look to be around the same age, so why would he be talking to him like he's older? This leads me to believe that the Crow is similar to Ghost Rider, where an ancient spirit of vengeance takes over somebody who is in dire need of help. To quote the comic, it says that it's not death if you refuse it. The Crow is not some invincible invincible superhero. He is just an instrument of destruction that refuses to accept death. I don't mean to make this comic sound like some edgy, grimdark, cheesy story either. The action, albeit entertaining and stylish, is still played for shock and is not pretty. This isn't the Punisher where you tune in every month to see some insane 80s action. It's way more visceral, and the whole comic has an air of bleak hatred to it. Around the last stretch of this comic, this really shines through, culminating in some brutal fight scenes, if you could even call them that, and you can feel the anger seeping off of each page. There's a mass amount of biblical symbolism as well, which I can't quite break down all of in this video, but it really does make the story more interesting than your average comic. Also, in my opinion, I believe that the ending to this comic is perfect, and it should have been adapted directly. With the body count probably in the hundreds, the Crow confronts T-Bird, the last one responsible for the wrongs done to Eric and Shelley. After his foot soldiers were viciously demolished, T-Bird tries to escape in a car, but is run off the road after a crow smashes through his windshield. And it couldn't be more perfect. This is the same road where the innocent lives of Eric and Shelley were crushed, but now someone guilty is going to get the same treatment in return. No cheesy one-liner or fancy kill. With his legs crushed by the car crash, T-Bird is unable to move. The last thing he sees is the Crow brandishing a hammer, spouting some cold, cryptic poetry, and then it cuts to black. We then see Eric in the snow at his fiance's grave, and that's how the story comes to a perfect conclusion, dripping in goth and punk darkness, and telling a depressing yet hopeful love story. James O Barr's The Crow is a disturbing, R-rated masterpiece. On a more serious note, I just want to say that I know I'm some 15-year-old kid who probably doesn't connect with or fully understand this story, but I know one thing for sure. Doesn't matter if you're 15 or 30 years old. This comic brings you into that world and makes you feel that loss. And if you've already experienced something tragic in your life before reading it, then the comic will act as a hand on your shoulder to help you through it. This story is a timeless piece of art that will always resonate with somebody's own feelings of grief or loss. To think that this comic almost didn't get published is insane, because it has helped more people than we'll ever know. So to end this, I'll just leave you with one of my favorite quotes that perfectly sums up The Crow. We shall never forget and never forgive and never ever fear, because fear is for the enemy. Fear and bullets.
One last go.